Hey there, you're tuned into the deep dive, and today we're peeling back the layers on a company you probably think you know inside out, Johnson& and Johnson.
Absolutely. I mean, for most of us, J&J is just, well, it's everywhere, isn't it?
It really is, as American as apple pie, you could say.
Right.
Woven into daily life, that baby powder smell, Band-Aids, Tylenol, even really critical
And they've
medicines.
got this reputation, right? Consistently ranked among the world's most admired corporations for decades, touching over 1 billion people daily, they say.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive. It's this fascinating, maybe deeply disturbing paradox.
Right. How can this company, so beloved, so trusted for generations, with its famous credo about never putting profits before people, how can it also be, at the center of these huge ethical scandals?
Yeah, these massive legal battles, accusations of putting the bottom line first, sometimes with just devastating consequences for people, for patients, consumers.
It's a jarring contrast.
It really is. So our mission today is to unpack this really complex, often troubling story of Johnson& and Johnson. We want to move beyond that polished public image, using our source material to reveal a much more nuanced history.
And what's interesting is how this whole thing started for the reporter behind our main source. It wasn't some big expose from the get-go.
No, not at all.
Mhm.
He was just assigned to cover the pharma industry. And then, bit by bit, he started uncovering this story that was just completely different from the one we all thought we knew.
A company that was, like, hiding in plain sight,
Mm.
ever present, but in some ways invisible.
So how did these cracks start to show? For our source, it kicked off with this kind of random encounter in an airport bar, of all places.
Yeah, sounds about right sometimes.
Right. He's a drug reporter sitting next to a pharmaceutical sales rep from Janssen, J&J's big drug unit. He tells her what he does. She kind of makes a face.
Huh, I can picture that.
But then she tells him this story, a story that apparently just fueled his reporting for years to come.
And it's a really revealing story, isn't it? This sales rep's confession.
Totally. She talks about her 10-year-old nephew. He gets into a schoolyard fight. The principal insists he sees a shrink.
Okay.
And because she sells Risperdal, this heavy-duty drug for schizophrenia, she offers to get him in quick with one of her, quote, favorite psychiatrists.
Uh-oh. I think I see where this is going.
Yeah. She expected the kid would just get a talking to. Instead, the doctor immediately gives her sister free samples of Risperdal.
The same samples the sales rep herself had probably just dropped off.
Exactly, days before. And get this psychiatrist was one of her whales.
Ah, the industry term. The big prescribers who drive bonuses.
Precisely.
Oh.
And J&J paid this guy, paid him well to give marketing talks about Risperdal to other doctors.
So he was essentially on their payroll pushing their drug.
That's what it sounds like. And you can imagine her reaction. She was shocked, regretted it instantly.
Uh,
She told her sister, think a minute before giving him that medicine. But it was too late.
or happened to the nephew.
Over the next year, he gained 25 pounds. Became so embarrassed about his size, he stopped going swimming with her. It's just heartbreaking.
Wow. And her confession, saying J&J's claims that Risperdal was safer were misleading. They came too late for so many kids, and adults too, presumably.
Way too late.
And this really highlights J&J's strategy, doesn't it? Marketing Risperdal way beyond what the FDA actually approved it for, which was schizophrenia.
Yeah, and the drug itself, 40 times more expensive than older drugs, but no more effective.
Yeah.
And the side effects were serious.
Really serious. Rapid weight gain, diabetes risk, strokes, and these awful neurological things, that tics and tremors, extrapyramidal side effects, they call them.
Which could last even after you stop taking the drug.
Exactly. Just terrible.
So how do you sell a drug like that for a condition like schizophrenia that, doesn't affect a huge percentage of the population? How do you make it a blockbuster?
Well, J&J figured out a way. They came up with a strategy: sell to the symptoms.
Right. Basically, ignoring the FDA rules, kind of defying the law.
Pretty much. They told their sales teams, look, Risperdal's approved for schizophrenia, right? And people with schizophrenia can have almost any psychiatric symptom.
So therefore,
Therefore, Risperdal could be marketed for everything: depression, agitation, you name it.
which is classic off-label promotion, pushing it for uses it wasn't approved for. And they particularly targeted children and the elderly.
Yes, that's where they saw the growth potential. Illegal potential, but as the source puts it, limitless and perilous.
Wow, that phrase really sticks. Limitless and perilous.
And a key example of how they exerted this influence was something called the Texas Medication Algorithm Project.
TMAP.
TMA, okay.
What was that?
So it's basically a guide for doctors on what drugs to prescribe. Initially, the algorithm included Risperdal alongside older, much cheaper antipsychotics.
Made sense.
But then there was an update, largely underwritten by J&J. And suddenly,
Let me guess. Only the expensive ones were left.
you got it. Only Risperdal and other pricey, atypical antipsychotics made the recommended list. If a doctor wanted to use an older, cheaper drug, they had to fill out paperwork justifying it. Every single time.
That creates a huge barrier, doesn't it? A huge incentive to just prescribe the expensive drug.
Absolutely. And the guy who led this algorithm update, Dr. Stephen Schoen, who was also the medical director for Texas Mental Health,
Yeah.
well, it later came out he'd taken illegal payments from J&J
Yeah.
and lied about it under oath, repeatedly.
Unbelievable. The corruption runs deep.
It seems so. And it wasn't just state officials.
No. Who else?
J&J actually funded NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Really? The patient advocacy group.
The very same. Funded them to lobby states to keep Risperdal on their formularies, the lists of drugs covered by insurance or state programs.
Even if it meant cutting other services because Risperdal was so expensive.
Exactly. Even at the cost of patient services.
Right.
It just shows how effectively corporate money can work behind the scenes to shape policy. It's quite chilling.
Okay, so that's the pharmaceutical side, at least to start. Let's shift gears now to something maybe even more fundamental to J&J's image. Comfort, safety. Johnson's baby powder.
Ah, yes. The golden egg, as they called it internally.
The golden egg. Why that name?
Well, think about it. It built this incredible emotional trust, didn't it? That connection between mother and infant. And that smell.
Oh, yeah. That smell is instantly recognizable.
Our sources say that scent actually imprinted on the brain's limbic system. It literally connected the brand to feelings of love and intimacy right from infancy. Powerful stuff.
Incredibly powerful. But here's where a much darker history comes into play involving asbestos.
Right, asbestos. We think of it now as this terrible carcinogen, but it was everywhere once.
Used for its fire resistance, right. Even in movie props like The Snow and the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, believe it or not. But by the mid-20th century, it was absolutely known to cause at least 4 deadly diseases: asbestosis, lung cancer, ovarian cancer, and mesothelioma.
And it's dangerous because of these tiny microscopic crystalline needles.
Exactly. They can literally spear your DNA, trigger cancer. And the terrifying thing is, even the tiniest exposures can be fatal. There's often no safe level.
And these dangers weren't exactly new discoveries, were they? Even ancient Greeks and Romans noticed issues.
That's right. Naturalists back then noted lung sickness in people who wove asbestos fibers. And then in the early 20th century, doctors in Europe saw horrific lung damage and incredibly high death rates among asbestos workers. The warnings were there.
So fast forward to 1968, a researcher, Dr. Arthur Langer at Mount Sinai, makes a discovery.
A really significant one. He was trying to grow asbestos in the lab, but instead he accidentally produced talc. And he noted, crucially, that they share key chemical ingredients.
Okay, so talc and asbestos are chemically related?
Very much so. And then in 1971, he found both talc and chrysal asbestos fibers in actual samples of Johnson's baby powder.
Wow. In the powder itself. And he told J&J.
Immediately, shared his findings directly with the company.
So how did J&J react? Their golden egg potentially contains a known carcinogen. What did they do?
Well, according to the sources, they definitely didn't want his findings published. They actively discouraged it.
Tried to keep it quiet.
Seems like it. Instead, you had New York City's top environmental official, Jerome Kretschmer, holding a press conference back in '71, basically telling New Yorkers to stop using talc-based powders altogether. That was a pretty clear public warning sign right there.
A public warning, but J&J internally was trying to suppress Langer's specific findings about their powder.
And publicly, they kept insisting their baby powder was asbestos-free. But privately, they admitted to the FDA that there were minor amounts of tremolite and actinolite, both are forms of asbestos in the talc.
So a total contradiction between their public stance and what they told regulators privately.
A complete contradiction. And it gets worse. There's evidence of internal documents, lab reports showing asbestos content, specifically tremolite. These were apparently eliminated before being sent to the FDA.
Eliminated? You mean destroyed or hidden?
Hidden, altered. There was even a handwritten note found on one original report saying, "Do not use this report."
Chilling. That speaks volumes about intent, doesn't it?
It certainly suggests a pattern of concealment. And this went on for decades.
And the story takes an even darker turn with this research they sponsored. Dr. Klidman.
Ugh, yes. Dr. Albert Kligman. a controversial figure to say the least. J&J sponsored him to test products, including talc and even asbestos, on vulnerable populations.
Specifically African-American prisoners and mentally disabled children.
Yes, injecting them with talc and asbestos. The experiments were described as exquisitely painful, with no follow-up on their long-term health. Just a shocking disregard for basic human ethics.
It's almost hard to comprehend. So J&J eventually sold its talc mining subsidiary, right, in 1989.
They did sell the subsidiary. But here's the thing. They didn't stop using talc. Other companies, like Pfizer, were switching to cornstarch around that time because of the concerns.
But J&J kept buying talc from suppliers and putting it in their powder.
Exactly. They kept buying it and using it. And then, much later, in 2019, you have a former J&J talc executive admitting under oath that the company's decades of statements claiming the baby powder was asbestos-free.
Well, that they were false.
Admitting perjury, essentially.
Pretty much. A stunning admission after years of denial.
And the human cost.
Yeah.
We heard about Tony Roberts. Decades of using baby powder multiple times a day developed ovarian cancer.
Her testimony was incredibly powerful. Using it on herself, her kids' hockey gear, even sprinkling it on the carpet. Just pervasive use based on that trust J&J cultivated.
And the jury awarded her over $4 billion in punitive damages, one of the biggest judgments ever.
A massive statement from the jury about the company's conduct.
But it's strange, isn't it, that even now some lawsuits still focus just on talc itself, not the asbestos contamination.
It is strange. The source suggests it's partly due to lawyers having built their cases around talc risks before the extent of the asbestos evidence really came out in force. Litigation strategies can be hard to change midstream, even when new evidence emerges. It's complicated. It really highlights how complex these legal battles become. Okay, let's pivot again to another major J&J story, one that's often portrayed completely differently. The Tylenol crisis of 1982.
Ah, yes, the textbook case study in crisis management. Or so we thought.
Right. We all remember the panic. Mary Kellerman, then the Janus family, dying suddenly from cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. Absolute terror swept the nation.
And the story goes that J&J responded brilliantly. Swift recall of 31 million bottles, costing $100 million, introducing tamper-resistant packaging that changed the whole industry.
Earned them that Harvard Business School case study, lauded as the gold standard of corporate responsibility in a crisis.
The absolute model of ethical response.
But our sources suggest that narrative needs a serious revision.
A very serious revision. For starters, J&J didn't immediately order a nationwide recall. They initially only agreed to a limited one, just in the Chicago area where the deaths occurred.
Even after they knew about a copycat poisoning attempt in California using strychnine, they still resisted a full recall.
For days, apparently. It suggests a much more hesitant, perhaps cost-conscious initial reaction than the heroic narrative allows.
Yeah.
That delay could have been fatal for others.
That really changes the picture.
And there's more. Authorities likely only even found the cyanide because of the unusual cluster of deaths in the Janus family. 3 people, same bottle, same night.
So it was almost luck they caught it.
Quite possibly. And the evidence suggests the real death toll from the Tylenol killer might have been higher than the 7 officially acknowledged. There were other suspicious deaths around that time that fit the pattern, but bodies weren't always tested for cyanide. The true scope might be unknown.
And then there's this really explosive theory about the potential killer, James William Arnold, a warehouse worker who apparently confessed to having cyanide.
Right. The allegation is that J&J executives might have known about him, or at least suspected a link to the Jewel Foods distribution network he worked for.
And the evidence cited is these panicked calls J&J supposedly made to specific drugstores served by Jewel Foods, even ones far from Chicago, while ignoring stores served by different distributors.
Exactly. If true, it implies they had specific knowledge they weren't sharing with investigators or the public, potentially trying to contain the problem quietly rather than raise a wider alarm. It flips the hero narrative on its head.
It absolutely does, if they knew and didn't tell.
And here's the truly bitter irony the source points out. After all this, the Tylenol brand actually ended up benefiting from the warm feelings associated with Johnson's baby powder.
Wait, how?
Because J&J handled the crisis publicly so well, reinforcing trust. But that trust was partly built on the baby powder image, which, as we now know, they were still lying about regarding asbestos at the time.
Wow. So one crisis, potentially mishandled behind the scenes, helps bolster the image damaged by another ongoing deception. It's like a house of mirrors.
A masterclass in reputation management, perhaps, but deeply cynical if you look closely.
And what about the FDA and all this? The regulator?
Well, the sources suggest the FDA was quick to absolve J&J of responsibility for the poisonings themselves, which maybe is fair, but they also surrendered their investigative role pretty quickly.
Why? Underfunding.
Partly that, yes. Chronic underfunding is a recurring theme. But, incredibly, they actually allowed J&J itself to test the returned Tylenol bottles for cyanide.
They let the company potentially implicated investigate itself, when J&J had every reason to downplay the extent of the contamination.
Exactly. It beggars belief, really. How could that happen?
It raises serious questions about regulatory capture, doesn't it?
It certainly points in that direction.
Yeah.
And consider the FDA commissioner at the time, Dr. Arthur Hayes Jr. The source calls him the most corrupt FDA commissioner in history.
Strong words. What's the basis for that?
Allegations that he took money from drug companies while he was leading the agency, and after leaving the FDA. He went to work for a PR firm owned by a former top J&J executive.
The revolving door strikes again. That casts a huge shadow over the agency's independence during a critical time.
A massive shadow. And beyond the '82 crisis, there were other issues with Tylenol itself.
Right, the acetaminophen risks.
Yeah. Back in 1976, the FDA approved extra-strength Tylenol, despite warnings from top medical journals like The Lancet and even its own advisory panel.
Warnings about what specifically?
About acetaminophen's liver toxicity, and its narrow margin of error, the small difference between a safe dose and a dangerous one.
But J&J marketed it as the safest option anyway.
Aggressively, which tragically led to a documented rise in accidental overdoses and liver damage. People thought safe meant they could take more.
And this led to heartbreaking cases, like the baby, Brianna Hutto.
Yes, a 5-month-old who died after receiving doses recommended by a hospital nurse, doses based on the concentrated infant formula J&J sold.
And during the trial, a J&J medical director actually said fatal incidents like that were just the cost of doing business.
He did, an absolute chilling admission. And he admitted they kept selling that concentrated infant formula for 25 years, knowing the risks, knowing babies were dying or suffering liver failure.
The cost of doing business, that's appalling.
It truly is an alarming level of acceptable risk right there.
Okay, let's transition now. J&J didn't just stay in consumer products. They became this pharmaceutical giant. A lot of that was driven by EPO, right? Procrit.
Absolutely. EPO, or Procrit, as J&J marketed it, became their single most profitable product ever. Huge seller.
And they marketed it heavily for anemia, especially in cancer patients getting chemo and dialysis patients, that Strength for Living campaign.
Very memorable campaign. But even early on, there were hints of problems. Potential links to heart issues, even tumor growth.
And the FDA's response.
Just force a very mild disclaimer on the label, something like, tumor growth cannot be excluded, which is, well, it's pretty weak language for such a serious potential risk, isn't it?
Incredibly weak. Not exactly stark warning.
Not at all. And then came the normal hematocrit trial.
What was that study about?
It was designed to see if giving more EPO to reach normal red blood cell levels would help patients. But the results were the opposite.
Oh, no. What happened?
The trial had to be stopped early, because the patients getting more EPO, the higher doses, were dying in significantly greater numbers. More heart attacks, more strokes, more blood clots.
A clear danger signal. So J&J published this immediately, warned doctors.
No, that's
Yeah.
the key point. They delayed publishing those results for years.
For years. Like, doctors were presumably prescribing higher and higher doses based on the earlier marketing?
Precisely. Doses soared, putting countless patients at risk, while J&J kept these critical negative findings under wraps.
That's a deliberate endangerment, it sounds like.
It's hard to see it otherwise. And it wasn't just that one trial. The sources revealed dozens of researchers found similar negative results, but J&J and Amgen, who co-marketed EPO, internally suppressed those findings too, kept them secret.
The pattern of suppression.
A clear pattern. And on top of that, they were encouraging massive Medicare fraud.
How?
By deliberately overfilling the EPO vials, giving doctors extra drug they could bill Medicare for, essentially doubling their profit on each vial. And they paid millions in kickbacks to doctors and clinics, too.
So suppressing safety data and defrauding Medicare. It's a multi-pronged strategy.
Exploiting the system from multiple angles, it seems.
Okay, let's look at another product. The Ortho-Evra birth control patch. What happened there?
Ortho-Evra is another shocking story. The source material describes J&J's plan to, quote, willfully deceive the FDA about the patch's estrogen problem.
An estrogen problem? What was it?
The patch delivered significantly more estrogen than traditional birth control pills, increasing the risk of blood clots. but J&J allegedly manipulated the data they submitted
Manipulated how?
by applying a correction factor, basically, just multiplying the estrogen levels they found by zero point 0.6, artificially reducing the reported amounts by 40%.
They just made up a number to make it look safer.
That's the allegation. Just applied this factor to make the numbers look better for the FDA submission.
Unbelievable. Did they get away with it?
Initially, yes. And they also withheld a key study, PHI 017, that showed higher estrogen exposure, first from the FDA for 2 years, and then from European regulators, too.
More suppression of inconvenient data.
Exactly. And then, the version of the patch they actually sold released even more estrogen than the one they used in the manipulated clinical trials. And they never told the FDA about that difference either.
So the real-world risk was even higher than the already downplayed risk they reported.
That's what the evidence suggests. It was a cascade of deception.
What were the consequences for women using the patch?
Devastating. We learned that one J&J executive actually quit over it, saying she couldn't stomach seeing young women dying of massive pulmonary embolisms.
Oh my God.
And by J&J's own internal calculations later on, it's estimated almost 5,000 women suffered heart attacks and strokes linked to Ortho-Evra.
5,000. That's staggering. Directly tied to a product they seem to have intentionally misrepresented.
It's a horrific toll.
This pattern seems relentless. Let's move into medical devices now. Was it the same story there?
Unfortunately, yes. A very similar pattern of prioritizing profits over patient safety, often enabled by regulatory loopholes.
Like the FDA's 510(k) pathway.
Exactly. That loophole allows companies to market new devices if they claim they're substantially equivalent to something already on the market, often bypassing rigorous clinical trials. J&J became masters at exploiting this.
So give us an example, the Pinnacle hip implants.
A prime example. These were metal-on-metal hip implants. The source describes this incredible moment. Just one day before submitting the design to the FDA, an engineer finds a major flaw. One of the design pairs being tested was literally falling apart.
One day before submission. Talk about bad timing.
Right. And J&J faced this terrible set of dilemmas, as the source puts it. Do they disclose the flaw, face months, maybe years of delays for redesign and testing,
Or do they hide it and push ahead knowing the device might fail?
exactly, hide it and risk, quote, wounding, crippling, and in some cases killing tens of thousands of patients?
That's a strike choice. What did they allegedly do?
They allegedly hid it. They apparently lied to the FDA about the device's clearance status, making it seem more vetted than it was.
And their strategy involved paying surgeons.
Millions. Through consulting agreements and these things called seeding trials. These weren't real scientific studies. They were designed to get surgeons using the implant and essentially acted as payoff schemes.
So get the device approved through deception, then pay doctors to use it widely.
That appears to be the playbook.
And the results for patients who got these Pinnacle hips.
Catastrophic. Extremely high failure rates. People develop pseudotumors, these nasty fluid-filled sacs around the hip joint. And worse, the grinding metal parts release toxic ions, cobalt and chromium, into patients' bloodstreams.
Leading to what kind of problem?
Crippling pain, needing revision surgeries, but also systemic poisoning heart problems, cognitive decline, vision loss, hearing loss, just awful outcomes.
And J&J's internal reaction.
This is maybe the most cynical part. Internal emails surfaced showing managers actually celebrating how the high rate of revision surgeries, meaning surgeries to fix or replace the failing implants, was fueling our above-market growth.
They were profiting from their own device failures.
Celebrating it, apparently, is hard to fathom.
Okay, another device. Vaginal mesh. ProLift. What's the story there?
With ProLift, used for pelvic organ prolapse, J&J did something even more audacious. They started selling it in 2005 without even asking the FDA for approval first.
Wait, they just launched it? No 510(k), no nothing?
They just started selling it, using a rationale that the components were similar to other approved products.
Yeah.
Highly irregular, and it immediately raised red flags.
And did doctors start seeing problems quickly?
Very quickly, surgeons reported high rates of complications, the mesh eroding through the vaginal wall, causing chronic pain, infections, inability to have sex.
So J&J acknowledged these issues, pulled the product.
Their response, again, seems to have been suppression. The source details how they deliberately removed data about dyspareunia painful sex from presentations to doctors and regulators.
Just wipe the data point.
Eliminated it. Despite internal emails showing their own executives knew about the consternation regarding mesh complications.
Leading to how many women being injured?
Hundreds of thousands worldwide suffered debilitating, life-altering injuries from these mesh products. ProLift was eventually withdrawn in 2012, But the widespread damage was already done.
It's just one after another. And then we get to the opioid crisis. How is J&J involved there? We usually hear about Purdue Pharma.
Purdue was certainly central with OxyContin, but J&J played a crucial, often overlooked role. Our sources show they explicitly copied Purdue's aggressive marketing playbook for their own fentanyl patches, Duragesic.
Fentanyl patches, extremely potent.
Extremely. And beyond their own products, J&J became the largest supplier of the key raw ingredients needed to make opioids, things like the bane. Through subsidiary companies that developed genetically engineered poppies grown mainly in Tasmania. They effectively controlled a huge part of the raw material supply chain that fueled the entire opioid epidemic.
So they weren't just selling finished drugs, they were supplying the very engine of the crisis.
A major supplier to other opioid manufacturers, yes. They were deeply embedded in the supply chain.
And did they push their own opioids hard?
Absolutely. They had this initiative called Project Pearl, specifically designed to co-promote their Duragesic patch alongside OxyContin. They targeted the doctors writing the most opioid scripts, the modern-day whales.
And they attacked generic competitors.
Launched a smear campaign against generic fentanyl patches to protect Duragesic's market share. And just like Purdue, they continued making false claims about fentanyl's low risk of addiction, even after the FDA warned them about it. Doctors kept listening, and the tragedy unfolded.
It seems like a consistent thread: downplay risks, aggressively market, challenge competitors, influence doctors.
And often, allegedly, mislead regulators.
Which brings us back to the FDA. How could all of this happen across so many different areas? Drugs, devices, consumer products over decades. The sources point heavily at the FDA itself, don't they?
They really do, framing it as a captive agency.
Captive house.
Largely because its budget relies heavily on fees paid by the very industries it's supposed to regulate. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUS, and similar acts for devices mean the FDA is financially dependent on pharma and device companies.
So the regulator essentially pay the regulators' bills.
Exactly. And this creates what the source calls a remarkable closeness. The FDA even refers to these companies as its main customer sometimes.
Main customer, not regulated entity. That's telling.
Very telling. And you see the results in cases like the Ghost recall in 2009.
What was the Ghost recall?
J&J News sort of lots of Tylenol, Motrin, and Zyrtec were contaminated, potentially with bacteria or particulate matter. Instead of announcing a recall, they hired contractors to quietly go into stores and buy up all the affected products off the shelves without telling the retailers or the public why.
A secret recall.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And the FDA didn't even learn about it until almost a year later. In 2010, the regulator was completely in the dark about a recall happening under its nose.
That shatters the image of the FDA as this vigilant watchdog, doesn't it?
Completely. It feeds into what the source calls the myth of the tough cop FTA.
Explain that myth.
It's the widespread belief, held by the public, and even, ironically, by many drug sales reps, that the FDA is incredibly strict, scrutinizing everything, ensuring safety.
And the industry likes this myth.
They cultivate it. It's a crucial defense in lawsuits. If a product harmed someone, they can say, well, the FDA proved it. They reviewed all the data. It implies government sanction, making thousands of people sales reps, doctors, patients, unwitting co-conspirators, as the source puts it.
Because they trust the FDA's oversight, which might actually be lacking or compromised.
Precisely. They think this can't be illegal or that dangerous. The FDA would have stopped it. But maybe the FDA didn't know or couldn't act or chose not to.
And looking inside J&J itself, what kind of culture allowed this? The source mentions a culture of ickiness.
Yeah, that phrase came from a sales rep. It's illustrated by things like executives giving incredibly evasive testimony in court.
Like saying honesty is a broad term.
Exactly. Or suddenly developing failing memories when shown incriminating documents they clearly authored or received. It suggests a culture where accountability was, shall we say, flexible, not just isolated incidents, but something more pervasive.
The source draws an analogy to the Challenger space shuttle disaster. How does that fit?
The idea is that J&J's slide wasn't one single catastrophic decision, but a years-long organization-wide drift away from its own stated principles, its credo. Like engineers raising concerns about O-rings before Challenger, there were internal warnings at J&J, but the system kept pushing forward.
Because bad behavior without consequence can be deeply corrupting.
That's the quote. When boundary pushing, or even outright illegal behavior, doesn't result in serious repercussions for the company or individuals, the boundaries just keep moving. Risks that were once unacceptable become normalized.
So why did this drift happen? Did they just become greedy?
The source suggests something slightly more complex, perhaps more insidious. It argues J&J's leadership genuinely believed they were creating new products with the intent to help the sick.
Okay, a noble goal on the surface.
Right. But this belief morphed into a conviction that because their intent was good, all their efforts must always be good, regardless of what the clinical trial data actually showed.
So inconvenient data must be wrong or misinterpreted or justifiable.
Something like that. And the mantra, every drug has risks, became twisted into an excuse to tolerate almost any level of risk, especially if the potential profits were high enough. It became a justification for bending or breaking the rules, all while claiming adherence to their credo.
Wow, that's a really disturbing way to look at it. Good intentions paving the road to, well, immense harm.
A profound distortion of purpose, it seems.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this really stark contradiction, aren't we?
Absolutely. J&J isn't just the company of scandals. They genuinely have produced incredible, life-saving innovations.
Yeah, the source mentions things like a vital new drug for TB, major advances in HIV treatment for adolescents, even disposable contact lenses, which revolutionize vision care for millions. They've done real good.
Undeniable good. Which makes the other side of the story, the widespread, harmful, illegal practices across so many divisions, pharma, devices, consumer, even more jarring.
It's like two different companies inhabiting the same corporate body.
And the source argues this isn't just about J&J. Their story is presented as a devastating indictment of the country's for-profit healthcare model at large.
Meaning the system itself enables this kind of behavior.
The argument is that the system, driven by profit motives, can simultaneously foster amazing innovation and deadly practices, that powerful interests like J&J can operate with relative impunity, protected from scrutiny, because the system is geared towards profit and the regulators are often under-resourced or captured.
So bringing it back to you, our listener, what do we take away from this? The source suggests that almost every American family has suffered profoundly from J&J's misdeeds, whether they realize it or not.
And that the FDA, the agency we trust to be our guardian, has never fulfilled this vital function effectively. That's a heavy conclusion.
It really is. So given that reality, what needs to change? We always talk about how knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied. But what happens when powerful entities seem protected from scrutiny, when the system itself might be part of the problem?
It's the fundamental question, isn't it? How do we demand accountability? How do we build a healthcare system, a regulatory system, that has greater immunity against these kinds of systemic failures, where public trust isn't so easily and repeatedly betrayed?
A tough question, maybe one without easy answers, something to definitely mull over.